So good afternoon. Welcome to this second series On the Edge, where we're looking at and thinking about this book, Being Interrupted, and the authors are going to come and speak to us on October the 13th. But today we have a local person coming to speak to us. But before we introduce him, I'd like to first of all say a prayer. Again, it's the prayer adapted from Augustine of Hippo, and it's a prayer for ourselves. Lord Jesus, let me know myself and know you, and desire nothing save only you. Let me do everything for the sake of you. Let me humble myself and exalt you. Let me think of nothing except you. Let me fly from myself and take refuge in you. Let me cling to nothing save only to you. And let me be poor because of you. Look upon me that I may love you. Call me that I may see you and forever enjoy you. Amen. And so this afternoon we have Simon Chesters, Reverend Simon Chesters, come to join us. He's recently been appointed Director of Ministry in Chester. He worked in Liverpool for a while, but started as a curate in this diocese. So Simon, it's lovely to have you. You're very welcome. Thank you very much. And you're talking to us on who is marginalised by the church. So over to you.
Great stuff. Thanks very much for having me. I will do the screen sharing thing every now and again, though I have to admit I struggle with it. So I'll sort of flip on and off, and we'll sort of go through from there. So let's give that a go first. Can people see that? So as James just said, we're looking at this book, Being Interrupted, and thinking today about who is marginalised by the church. And I am privileged to be here. Genuinely, it's a privilege to be here and to speak to you. But also, I am privileged is just a place to start. And that's one of the things that this book is looking at. And in particular, I'll be thinking about chapter 4 in the book, which is thinking about the church's issues with privilege. And one of the things I love about this book is that actually it starts off with asking a number of questions. We're going to be saying who is marginalised by the church, and it's a really interesting question to say, who do we automatically think we mean by saying who is the church? There's the question of who are we, and I think there's quite an interesting question that they ask in the book, that it's hazardous to use that language of we because it sort of presumes who we are. And one of the things I really liked about this book is that it actually starts off in chapter 1 with saying, who am I? Stop the screen share there. One of the things I love about the book, as I said, is that actually it acknowledges that you are here thing, which is to say that everybody is standing somewhere. It's one of the big insights from quite a number of recent strands of thinking politically, philosophically, and so on. Everybody is standing somewhere, and you need to acknowledge that. You need to acknowledge your position, and you also need to acknowledge, in many cases, the privilege that that position brings. If you do get to read the book, and I wholeheartedly recommend it, one of the things I love about it is it starts with the two authors, Ruth and Al, saying, this is me, this is where I'm from. Oh, great, that'll be somebody ringing me up in the background to tell me that BT are about to take over my Wi-Fi or something like that, so do forgive it on that front. So, who am I? And where am I coming from? And there was one particular phrase that really struck me in one bit of the book. In talking about, and I think Lynn may be talking about this next week, in talking about one of the temptations, which is that when we read a Bible passage, we put ourselves in Jesus's place. One of the things, one phrase that's similar to that is the writer on preaching, David Day, who said, how often do we head for the best seats in a reading? Do we place ourselves in the position of Jesus? And he said the realization that, and this links in with some of what Jane and Liz were saying last week about those different economies of the church. One of the dangers of the model, even of giving out, is that we place ourselves in the position of Jesus going to the outsider. Al, in telling his own story, says at one point that this danger served to reinforce, perpetuate, and deepen the power imbalances that were often already between us, with me being, and this was the bit that struck me, the multiply privileged white, middle-class, straight, able-bodied, male, ordained minister that I inescapably am. I am privileged to be here. It's lovely to be invited, but also I am multiply privileged in, well, all of the ways that he just mentioned. So I thought it might be worth saying a little bit about where I'm coming from, because I'd like to encourage us all to be thinking in these discussions, in this thought process, where are we coming from? So who am I? Jane said I'm local. I currently am sat in Chester, on the Welsh side of Chester, and my home church is a place called St Mark's Saltney. And I'm originally from the Wirral. I was brought up on the Wirral as part of, well, what in church terms is mixed heritage, because my mum's side of the family are Irish Catholics from Rockferry, and my dad's side of the family are Church of England types from Bebington, for those of you who are aware of some of the geography of the Wirral. Both my parents actually ended up sort of homeless and casting themselves on the help of their families very early on in life, because both of their fathers died very young. And this was in a situation where actually both of them found themselves in the situation where they had to sort of be taken in by and supported by other members of the family. My mum worked in Liverpool in Bold Street for a while as a window dresser, and my dad worked in insurance and gradually sort of worked his way up and so on. And so they were people who sort of bettered themselves. Me and my brother got sent off to a minor public school on the Wirral, though they'd be cross with me for calling them that, and were the first members of our families to go off to university. In many ways, I am a walking stereotype as a Church of England clergy bot, because I went to university in Cambridge. I worked after that in the IT industry for a number of years, and then I went off to Vicar Factory to train to be a vicar, and I went off and trained in Oxford. So, you know, the Oxbridge stereotype, I'm really playing hard on that one. Whoever wins the boat race, I'm fine with it. Also, interestingly, linking in with some of the stuff that Ruth, one of the authors, says in the book, I also arrived at both those places and realized that though I was, in many cases, extremely privileged, I was also mixing with, well, topically, I might say the sort of people who think that John Lewis is a bit down market when it comes to interior decor. But still hugely privileged in all of that. One of the things that they're getting at in this book is to say we need to be aware of where we are coming from, where we are standing, and what that predisposes us to spot or not spot, to hear or not hear. And in particular, and it's the title of the book, that idea of allowing ourselves to be interrupted by others who might be from other places. And part of my privilege as well is not just that I've come from a privileged background in very many ways, but also that it's been my privilege for my story to intersect with a number of other people from very different places. One of the things that's part of my story is the fact that I'm married. Yes, another tick in the stereotype box there. My wife came from quite a different social background in many ways. Similarly, one of the first people in her family to go to university. We have a very good friend who uses the same phrase about her upbringing as my wife does, which is that she says that she was brought up on an estate. What's interesting is that that phrase means two radically different things. Our friend was brought up on an estate, which meant an estate in the country, in total Downton Abbey stuff. My wife was brought up on a housing estate, and actually her grandparents had been in service below stairs at one of the big houses in Hereford, which is where she's from originally. The other big part of her story is that she's a secondary school teacher at a school on the Wirral, which, because of the way education works on the Wirral, is called a comprehensive, but is effectively a secondary modern. And so is working largely with the kids who failed the 11 plus, and that's how come they're at that particular school. When I graduated from Oxford, from Vicar Factory, as Jane was mentioning earlier, I went to be a curate in a place called Bidston in Birkenhead, and ended up living on one of the estates that I'd been brought up not to go anywhere near because it was a rough and dangerous place. And it was probably one of the most massive privileges of my life to have lived among and alongside people whose experience was very different. Who were suspicious of me being in the clergy because they thought I was in it for the money. Where I had come from, I really wasn't. I'd given up at work as an IT consultant, and our family finances were very different. But compared to all of the people that we were living alongside, we were massively privileged because of the stipend that I received and the work that my wife did when she was working, actually at that stage, still in secondary education, but also working for a charity doing drugs awareness education, which was, again, a really significant part of the experience for the both of us. And as Jane said, I've spent the past 10 years working across the water in Liverpool Diocese alongside colleagues who have endlessly reminded me that I'm not a proper Scouser at all. I'm a total plastic Scouser and a posh boy from the Wirral. But in particular, working in a diocese, very committed to working with a predominantly urban, largely multiply deprived set of congregations and people, and struggling to engage with what I think the authors rightly put their finger on, of the recurring middle class culture of the Church of England in particular. And other stories that I've been privileged to be part of. One of my close colleagues in Liverpool Diocese is deaf and works primarily with the deaf church. And I remember going with her to a conference which was for deaf people from deaf church across the country. I was invited and privileged to be invited as a guest speaker at that. And just realizing that I was the only person there whose first language was not British Sign Language, or whose second language was not British Sign Language. And to have just a glimpse of what it feels like to be in a large gathering thinking, I am seriously in the minority here. To be at the point where we went into discussion groups and everything went quiet and I didn't know what anybody was saying. And so there are all of these points where we need to be aware of where we are coming from. So in all I say, that's where I'm coming from. That's some of where I'm standing. And some of what I've been privileged to hear and be party to with some of the people who, at my best moments, I've allowed myself to be interrupted by. And it's worth asking for ourselves, who are we? What's our story? What are the privileges that we've got? If you do get hold of a copy of this book, there's a really interesting self-awareness exercise in one of the chapters, which just asks you to go through and answer some questions about yourself. And it gives you little points that you acquire or take off for various things. It's a really interesting exercise in terms of thinking, what are the privileges that I've grown up with? What are the experiences that I've probably not had because of those privileges? So just pause and think for a moment. Who are you? Where are you standing? What's your story been? What are the privileges that you've had? And what are the interruptions that you've been privileged to have as well? Now, one of the other things I love about this book is it also makes clear that this is all quite complex. That phrase about being a multiply privileged person. Interestingly, I think somebody last week used the phrase UPA, urban priority area parishes. One of the terminologies that we tended to use in Liverpool Diocese more frequently was areas of multiple deprivation, areas which were multiply disadvantaged by a number of factors. And that idea of it being multiple is really quite important. I was listening to a news podcast that I listen to daily this morning, and it was talking about the recent news of the trial of the R&B singer R. Kelly in the States, who's recently been finally, after a long number of years, convicted of multiple accounts of sexual abuse, misconduct, harassment, trafficking, and so on. And there was an interesting interview with one of the people who had sort of broken the story originally and had followed it for a number of years. He's a well-known music critic in the United States, a guy called Jim DeRogatis. And he said this, and this really struck me. He said, "I pay tribute to the incredibly brave young Black women who trusted this fat white rock critic to tell their story, who said to me, 'No one is listening.' Their bravery is unparalleled. In speaking out, they were vilified on social media. They were vilified by their friends, their families, their churches, their schools, and nobody believed them for far too long." In reference to those brave young Black women, he identifies at that point three of a number of axes that the book identifies in terms of both privilege and exclusion. And I'm going to do the screen share thing again at this point. And in particular, it talks about these different categories, the categories of race, class, gender, children, and what they refer to as the more than human creation. And they say in talking about the church, this, which again was one of the things that really struck me. They say we live in a culture which is largely not good at listening, at hearing others. And when it comes to the church, we can sometimes kid ourselves, I'm paraphrasing there, we can sometimes kid ourselves that we are hearing these things because we are Christians. And he says, a more uncomfortable possibility is that we Christians are in some ways at least more oblivious to the wider world, that there are aspects of our DNA as Christian communities, what we believe, how we behave and order our collective life, that exacerbate certain structural injustices and uphold certain privileges in ways that our wider society is in fact more conscious of and attempting to deal with, however imperfectly. It is this third possibility, profoundly unsettling as it might be, that we are wanting to focus on in this book. And so very briefly, I just want to say a couple of things about each of these points as a sort of starter for some thought process and some discussion about race, class, gender, about children, and about, and I'll come back to that phrase, the more than human creation. So thinking about race, now Jane mentioned last week, I think it was, that the average Anglican is actually a Black woman in her 20s. That is globally the average Anglican. It is not the case in this country in terms of the Church of England. Now, interestingly, one of the things that they say in the book is when we say the church, who do we mean by the church? Upstairs at the moment, beavering away on her research dissertation, is my 23-year-old daughter, who is actually currently at university in Oxford, at Oxford Brookes, the best university in Oxford. And the churches that she's been going to in Oxford, interestingly, she's largely been unusual for being white. There are plenty of churches in our country which are sometimes referred to, for example, as black majority churches. There are plenty of churches where actually, if you go to those churches and you're a white person, you will be in the minority. It's fair to say that is unusual for Church of England churches, however. Now, there's complexity here again, and some of it is a context of literally where we are standing geographically. I remember when I was a curate in Bidston in Birkenhead, I went to a meeting for what were then referred to as urban priority area parishes, and somebody said, well, of course, urban ministry is intensely multi-ethnic. And me and my colleague did pipe up in one of the discussion groups and say, well, actually, we're on an estate, outer estate in Birkenhead, where ethnic diversity mostly means the Welsh. It's the most radically white area I've actually ever lived in my life. But the racial makeup of this country, and interestingly, even the concept of race, I think, is worth challenging and just saying, what on earth do we mean by that and where does it come from? That is rapidly changing within this country. And it's fair to say that the C of E is not necessarily keeping pace with that. One of my experiences over the past 5 years in particular is the job that I was doing with Liverpool Diocese was working as Director of Vocation, so working with people exploring lay and ordained ministry, in particular spending a lot of time with people exploring ordained ministry. We made some progress in terms of seeking to broaden the range of ethnic heritages that we have represented among our ordinands. But I was still very much struck by the conversation I had with somebody from an Afro-Caribbean background who said, I'm just conscious whenever I go to church stuff, I'm the only brown face in the room. And having the conversation with him about the fact that actually, if this is going to change, there will need to be people who are in that situation, but that is a deeply uncomfortable and difficult situation to be in. And it ties in with a whole pile of other complexities. 2 weeks into the job as Director of Vocations, I ended up in a bit of a wrestling match with the Home Office as we sought to appoint a curate from Uganda to one of the churches in central Liverpool, an area which it's fair to say doesn't have people queuing up to go to it most of the time, in one of the most deprived and ethnically diverse contexts in Liverpool Diocese, and to experience firsthand the hostile environment from the Home Office at that point, and the fact that in the end we could only appoint him to that post by sending him back to Uganda so he could apply again from there, despite the fact he'd been living in this country for the past 4 or 5 years. There's a complexity here again. And once again, I love the fact that this book addresses that complexity. I said the context that was in Bidston was largely white and ethnic diversity was the Welsh. Actually, we were blessed to have a number of people from an East Asian heritage in that church. And interestingly, talking to somebody exploring ordination who's from a Chinese heritage, he said, I find the term black and minority ethnic bit offensive, really, because it's a sort of catch-all. And actually the experience of being a Chinese person in, for example, Liverpool, which has a long heritage of actually being fairly welcoming to the Chinese community, felt very different to his colleague and friend being from an Afro-Caribbean heritage in that context. And in the midst of all of that, it's been my privilege earlier in the year to be involved with somebody like Aaron Aurora, who has chaired the recent Church of England Working Party on racial justice. He came and did the Deacons Retreat for Liverpool Diocese this last summer. Massive privilege to be involved with him. And I sit here actually pretty embarrassed about the fact that the recommendations of the report that were made by the group he co-chairs with my former opposite number in another diocese as Director of Vocation, Sonia, that recommendation was broadly rejected by the General Synod in terms of the appointment of racial justice officers in every diocese. Class loomed very large in a lot of the work that I've been involved with and still does. Bishop Mark has been very involved over the past number of years in the Church of England rethinking how it does its vocational selection processes and how we potentially embrace what I've heard him say on a number of points, the people who are the unseen called. God is calling them, but we just ain't noticing because of a number of our processes and bits of our culture. And some of the time we need to allow ourselves to be interrupted by that. When looking at the changes to that particular process, there was one point where I and the team I was working with in Liverpool were hearing a great address from somebody who was talking about a particular approach that they were going to use. And she, a lovely woman who would cheerfully identify as somebody who was definitely white, definitely middle class, definitely from there, said, and we think this approach is going to work really marvelously for the people who've been excluded, who are from estates and poorer backgrounds and so on and so forth. At that point, she was impressively interrupted by two of my colleagues who came from exactly those contexts, who both stuck their hand up and said, that's a lovely idea, but actually where we're from, they're going to hate it. There is a profound danger of people like me and her thinking, how can we as middle-class people lay on things which are going to be good for people from that kind of background? And for those two colleagues of mine who very much had managed to get through the Church of England system into ordained ministry, very much by the skin of their teeth in one particular example, they actually were able to speak up and say to themselves, no, actually from where we are from and where we are currently ministering, this kind of looks like middle-class people trying to think themselves into our shoes, and on this particular point, it is not working. I'm grateful to say that actually the national team said, right, we really need to pay attention to this and take that on board. There's a great quote in here from Lynn, who's going to be on next week in this series, who says, rather than changing the structures to better value the gifts and experience of working class Christians, the Church of England tends to prefer at best middle-class leaders with a heart for the poor, guilty as charged. At what point do the working classes get to speak for themselves? And there's a whole pile of issues lurking in there, which they point out in terms of where the historic resources of the Church of England are addressed and so on. And also, I guess there's something about being aware of what we have perhaps got used to. I was not brought up in church circles. I came to faith in my teens because my mum was a left footer and my dad was a right footer. I was brought sort of kind of nowhere and not going to a Catholic church, not going to an Anglican church, going to neither really. One of the shocks for me about joining the Church of England in particular, much as I love it, one of the things I despair about it, and it frustrates me about it, is our fixation on power and privilege and hierarchy and position and rank and so on and so forth. I'm pulling one of those maneuvers today. I'm wearing a clerical collar. Okay. But we have all of these things. They point out the romance that historically the Church of England as the established church has had with the trappings of power and privilege and hierarchy and so on. And one of the things that always worries me is when people get in touch and say, well, you need to address me as the Right Reverend, Venerable Doctor, Most Esteemed XYZ, ABC, BBC, CIA, you know, and so on. I want lots of letters in front of and after my name. As I remember one friend saying, if you've ever used the words, don't you know who I am? Well, I think we probably know who you are. And that idea of hierarchy and privilege is really very important for us to be just pausing and thinking about in terms of all of these things. Thinking about gender, again, guilty as charged on this one. I am male, very much so. That's how I identify, and that's where I'm coming from. I am currently, and have been for a number of years, privileged to work with predominantly female colleagues, actually, in terms of those in active, non-retired, ordained and licensed ministry in my home church. I'm in the minority being a man. I'm privileged to work largely with a female team and have done over a number of the years. Though interestingly, I've also been in a position to see, not so much in my home church, but elsewhere, female colleagues who aren't exactly insulated from the lure of privilege and title and exercising their positional power. But working in particular with an institution where we have, in many cases, a predominantly female membership, and because of that, a disproportionately male leadership. Interesting comparing notes with my wife in terms of that being very like how a lot of schools seem to function, particularly at the primary level. There is stuff to address here. And one of the more painful businesses of my life over the past 5 years has been sitting down and speaking to women offering themselves for ordained ministry, and having to talk through the reality of being part of a church where their ministry will not be recognised or indeed seen as actually being ordained ministry by colleagues. Now, that is the reality with which the Church of England works. The 5 guiding principles are enshrined to some degree in our law, as is pointed out in the book there. But there is a reality there which I'm conscious I, as a man in ordained ministry, do not have to deal with subjectively. And it's been a painful business for me, having to talk through with female colleagues the reality of what they are probably letting themselves in for if they are to be ordained. There's a whole pile of stuff that we could talk about gender and complexity. One of the things that equally concerns me is that this is about men as well as about women. The fact that if you are a man under 40 in this country, the thing most likely to kill you is yourself. Remains something concerning, and that when we talk about toxic masculinity, yes, it's toxic for women. I think it's toxic for men as well. And that's before we even get to the whole set of complexities about what on earth we mean by gender anyway. In thinking about children, I'd just like very swiftly to show you a video clip, which I'm indebted to Liz Shercliffe for pointing me towards. So again, high risk strategy. I'm going to try and share my screen at this point. And share sound. And here is a video from a number of young people talking about their experience of church.
I think that the church does come across a little old-fashioned.
The church right now is kind of more aimed at old people.
It's mainly run by adults now, or virtually all run by adults now. So we're kind of sticking to the ways that they always have been.
If we're not involved in the church and from a young age, then we're not going to be able to kind of express our faith and in the same way that we would be able to if we're involved.
It tends to be based on what the older generation prefers the church to be.
I've been up in the church community since the day I was born, and whilst I have seen a few changes, I think there could be a few more.
The image of Sunday schools can be just reading the Bible and colouring stuff in, which isn't what it can be, and it can be a lot more fun.
It's really important to try to up the inclusion of young people and to help balance out the ratio of young people to old people.
I think teenagers are very strong-willed these days, so it's harder to persuade them. So by the time they leave the church, if they're not already a Christian, they're probably not going to decide to be one afterwards.
I think it'd be easy to bring my friends to church if we had like a youth group or something to bring them to, so we could introduce them to the church.
We might be able to lead more services in the future, or even get involved with stewardship and welcoming people.
Camping perhaps, or hiking, or maybe even going to places like zoos or aquariums.
I would say that the single biggest thing that the church today can do in this country to start reaching young people more is to not at all dilute the word of God.
Introducing like some sort of food, or just like some sort of way for the children to get together.
Although it is good to sing old hymns, like traditional hymns, they should also incorporate modern songs as well.
Now I'd like the churches to change their timing or have another service on a different day.
So maybe if some churches were a bit more modern and suitable to this day of age, then it might be something that might be more welcoming to people who have just been around during this kind of time.
Church is meant to be about a family, so maybe encouraging some of the older members of all ages, from maybe young adults even to older adults, to just try and connect with the younger members.
Church can be anywhere. For example, you could have a Bible study with friends if a youth leader could set that up somewhere.
Now, when I heard about Youth Speak, I was very excited because it means that the church might be able to involve the youth more in future activities.
I think it's important so that then we can develop our faith into future years and maybe pass that message on to other children.
At the end of the day, young people are the future of the church. And if we're not being involved in it, then we're not going to be interested in it, and the future isn't going to be very bright.
And it's good to introduce these new things, and even if it doesn't work, it's worth the try, isn't it?
Okay. Very swiftly coming on to one final area, and I'd like to jump into the sort of discussion end of things. One of the things that the authors quite rightly point out is that we are indebted to young people, whether that's somebody called Greta or some of those people we have just seen, for pointing out the fact that the urgent need of the creation which God has made is something that theologically and practically we have often neglected. And I love their description of our thoughts of the more than human creation. I remember being struck a number of years ago by a talk which was on the last few words of the book of Jonah. The last few words of the book of Jonah are, "and also much cattle." The story of Jonah finishes with God saying, "Should I not have been concerned with Nineveh, which is full of so many people, and also much cattle?" I've thrown a whole pile of stuff at you there, and I'd like to sort of open things out, really, because there's challenge here and there is discomfort here. And I think there's something about knowing where we ourselves are coming from, and also about thinking about how might we as individuals and as church communities allow our stories to be interrupted by the stories of others, perhaps from some of the areas that we've been talking about through this time. So hopefully that gives you some things to think about. Over to you to sort of talk about that. Any thoughts, any comments, any questions?
Hi.
Hi,
just before I go, there's one area that I feel quite strongly about that's often left out, and I noticed it was sort of left out in your list, is people with a disability.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the church does an awful lot.
Yep.
Really, I mean, it comes back to the point where we do have stereotypes, and a person with a disability can be is a person first. Mm-hmm. Disability is second, and language is so important in that respect. And we just lump people together. I think there's a lot of stereotypes that we do. So I just feel the church is very poor in that area. They put a hearing system in, but a large number of people with a disability don't have a hearing impairment. I think they've done their job then.
Yeah. And interestingly, one of the great things that the authors say is, when we ask who is marginalised by the church, we're going to talk about these particular categories, but we could have a list as long as your arm. Where do we stop? You've got to focus on some points. But yeah, thoroughly agree. I mean, as I said, it's been a massive privilege working with colleagues who are deaf, colleagues in wheelchairs, colleagues with with visual impairments, and a whole range of other stuff. And again, the sort of the differently abled, disabled discussion and so on. Yeah, There was a bit, when I was handled that title, who is marginalised by the church, there was a bit of me that wanted to say, well, who isn't, to some degree or other. So thanks for that, Pam, really helpful. Jezza.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, thank you for that. Your category children, the young lady that said she doesn't want to go to a church that dilutes the word of God. Do you think that's happening in our churches?
I think it's probably happening to a greater or lesser degree in absolutely all of our churches. There is stuff about the message which we will always feel uncomfortable with and shy away from. They are probably different bits in different churches. So we've all probably got different blind spots and different bits that we're sort of, actually emphasizing, de-emphasizing, missing out, etc. So to one degree, I think we're probably all needing to see what's the particular plank in our particular eye, as it were. But yeah, I mean, when she made that comment, I remember thinking, oh, I'd be fascinated to have a conversation about what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's a rarity.
Jill.
I've been thinking a lot about how we communicate our message. So just going back to mainly being white and middle class, and a lot of our information and discussion is book-based, isn't it? Word-based. And some people like to communicate with pictures or through silence. And so there are many different ways to get our message over, but I think a lot of the time it tends to be either word-based or listening and speaking. So there's just all sorts of different intelligences, I think, that aren't tapped into sometimes when we share our message.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's some, I mean, there's a whole set of cultural stuff linked there, but also some of the time, I mean, again, one of the things that people sort of sometimes sort of crunch together is being from a particular social grouping economically, and what's sometimes referred to as non-book culture. Equally, there's a whole pile of people who are profoundly middle class and moneyed and so on, who can read but don't, and actually that's not going to be their primary way of engaging with information and so on. So yeah, I think there's something about, I'd agree, thinking about what's the variety of ways of communicating and embodying our faith that we're thinking of and engaging with. And actually, back to Pam's point about people who have a variety of challenges as far as disability goes. Some of the things I've really gained from have been working with people who don't engage with certain media, but engage better with others as a result. So yeah, there's a great deal to be learned from a variety of other people.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for opening up the next stage and those different categories, a few challenging things there, I think, for us to take away for the week. Thank you all for coming. And next week, it's Reverend Lynn Cullins who's going to speak on what would Zacchaeus do? And that's chapter 6, if you happen to have the book. So we look forward to seeing you next week. And thank you so much, Simon. And see you all next week.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.